Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Today's video is going to be my November wrap-up. I read 6 books in November and 5 of them were nonfiction. The first one I wanted to talk about was my favorite book of this month, and that's Unbroken by Hillenbrand. This is the story of a young man named Louis Samperini. He grew up in Torrance, California, and he enlists in the army. His plane crashes and he, along with 2 other crew members, survive, and they survive in the open sea where they deal with starvation, thirst, sharks, enemy aircraft, all kinds of things. They're out there in the ocean for weeks, and they're finally rescued, or so you think, but they're actually taken to a POW camp. For the next 1.5 to 2 years, they suffer even more horrific circumstances living in this POW camp where they are starved and tortured and just broken. But what really made this book special for me was that even with all of this going on, and even with, you know, this situation that Louis is in the POW camp where it's designed to break these men, he still keeps faith and has an optimistic fighting spirit, and that was incredibly inspiring to me. After the war is over, he's shipped back to California and he reunites with his family, and that's where I kind of got emotional reading this book. I actually listened to the audiobook of this. It was the first audiobook that I ever finished, and I'm really happy that even though I really enjoy the audiobook, I have the physical copy, because the physical copy has a bunch of pictures that helps put a face to the name of all the characters that she's talking about. And there's just this one picture where Louis is finally home and he reunites with his mother and his sisters, and I just got so emotional when I saw that picture because I felt like I had gone through so much with him in this book. Knowing that it really happened, it just made it that much more amazing to me that he was able to survive all that. And so it was just so satisfying to me that he was finally home. However, when he does finally get home, he deals with all of the memories of what he experienced, you know, in the army, in the plane crash, and later in the POW camp. And so he takes up drinking. He's married, but it's not a happy marriage, and so eventually he turns to religion, and that kind of turns his life around. And even though I'm not religious, I really do think that he found a lot of comfort in religion and really changed his life and become who he really wanted to be. And so I really love this. I am so happy that I read it. I know this book has had a lot of hype. I can't even talk. But I think it's well deserved. I also think this book is not for everybody because Hillenbrand kind of goes into detail about some horrific things that I honestly wish I could have just skipped. Some of these images just are seared into your brain, and so that's what happened in this book. A lot of the horrible things that happened to Louis, I was just like, I really don't need to know all that. Also, it's very difficult to read about the conditions in the POW camp and how other people, you know, what was happening in other camps, what was happening when the men came back home. All kinds of horrible things happened during this time. And so if you have like a weak stomach, or if you're someone that's very sensitive to torture and things like that, then I don't recommend this book because there are all kinds of details in here. However, if you can deal with those things or read about those things, then I definitely recommend this book. I think it's one of my top nonfiction books ever. I am so happy I read it. I gave it 5 stars. The next book that I read was another 5-star read, and that's Anne of Green Gables by Montgomery. I actually read this book when I was really small. I think I was 9 or 10 when I read it, and this was one of my favorite books as a kid. I identified with a lot of things that she said and did. It was my first experience as a reader to have someone that I identified with in a book. So it's been so many years since then. I think it's been like 20 years since I've picked up this book, and so when I reread it, it was like I was reading it for the first time, and I just enjoyed it even more. If you're not familiar with the story, this is the story of Anne Shirley. She's a young orphan girl who is adopted by an older couple, Marilla and Matthew. They are looking for a young boy to help on their farm, and so when Anne shows up, they're like, who are you? What are you doing here? But they decide to take her in, and she kind of wins them both over. Anne is a very, she has a huge imagination. She's very sensitive and dramatic and over the top and kind of annoying at times. But she's very lovable. The author doesn't go into a lot of detail, but we can kind of understand or read between the lines and see that Anne has not had the best childhood. She's actually been through some traumatic experiences and has moved from home to home. And so she uses her imagination as a coping mechanism. It is an escape from her life. And she takes that with her to Marilla and Matthew's home in Green Gables. At first, she's a very imaginative child, very talkative. She doesn't shut up, and she loves nature. So she's always outside, and she loves her best friend Diana. But then she starts school and starts to set goals for herself and grows up into a young woman who is smart and dedicated. And then when tragedy strikes towards the end of the book, Anne is faced with a very difficult decision. So I really enjoyed it. Once again, I thought this book had a surprising amount of depth. I didn't remember how beautiful it was written, but some of the passages in here, I swear I would just read them over and over. I thought there was never a dull moment, and the dialogue was perfect, the scenery, the description of Green Gables. You can't help but want to go there and live there. I cannot wait to read the second book in the series because I just enjoyed this one just so much. I'm really glad that I reread this, and rereading this book really makes me want to reread other favorites of mine that I haven't touched in years and years. So maybe in 2018 that can be a goal. The next book that I read was Deep Down Dark, and this is the story of the 33 miners who were trapped in a mine in Chile in 2010. They were trapped for 69 days. I think that was a record. And this is basically their story. The author, Hector, he's a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, and he decided to tell their story. He interviewed all 33 men and was able to kind of get their backstories, talk about what happened in the mine. He introduces everybody that was involved in the rescue efforts, and then he talks a little bit about how the men lived in the mine and what their lives were like after they were rescued, because the story got a lot of press. This was very interesting. Another story about survival and hope and keeping faith and working together in the midst of impossible odds. The fact that none of these men were injured when this accident happened in the mine is kind of a miracle. Most people thought that they were all dead, or maybe one or two were alive. The fact that they were able to survive for so long. They were rescued, or the rescue kind of started, I think, after the first 30 days, I want to say. They were able to drill a hole into the mine, but they were only able to like send parcels and letters, and they were able to send it down like the shaft of a drill, but they weren't actually pulled up and out of the mine until 69 days. Tobar doesn't shy away from painting the men exactly as they were. Some had very different personalities, and he kind of focuses on how some of them reacted compared to others. I thought that he tried to give us a glimpse of their personalities and their backstories while being really fair. He's not trying to portray the men as being something that they're not, and I really appreciated that. My one criticism of this book, and one of the reasons I didn't give it 5 stars, is that I felt like some of the stories or events or some of the information that Tobar added in here was kind of unnecessary, and I really just wanted to get back to the story. Another thing is that there are 33 men to talk about, so sometimes it gets very confusing. Maybe some more pictures could have been added so that we could keep track of the men a little bit better, because the pictures that he does include here in the front is just of all 33 of them, the men, and it's like black and white, gritty, and you kind of can't really tell who's who. I read this on audiobook, by the way. This was my second audiobook, but I would look at this picture to kind of see who was being talked about, and that kind of helped a little bit, but I think like more pictures would have been better. And throughout the book too, I like flipped through and I didn't see any, so I was kind of disappointed in that. But overall, I thought it was really good. The audiobook was great. I think the narrator did a fantastic job. I'll have all of the narrators listed down below for the audiobooks that I'm going to talk about. And I just really appreciated how Tobar told this story. If you're into stories about survival or just want to read about this story, which is really fascinating, then I really recommend this. It's not very long, and the audiobook is amazing. So again, I'll have those details linked down below, but I gave this one 4 stars. I really enjoyed it. The next book I read was The Wright Brothers by David McCullough. And this is a story about the Wright brothers, Wilbur and Orville, back in the early 1900s, where they were able to build the first successful airplane. McCullough talks about other men that tried to also build airplanes, but they weren't successful and they weren't able to stay up in the air very long. It took them years to research how to build an airplane, and then even more years after that to test the airplane, build materials, lots of trial and error. They would fail time and time again, but they kept trying until they were successful. And that's really what this book is about. Their relationship as brothers, their family life, what it took for them to build an airplane that was, you know, able to stay in the air, all the records that they broke, the sensation that they caused in Europe and in the United States. Whatever could go wrong did go wrong for them, but they didn't give up. They kept at it and they were successful in the end, and that's what I really enjoyed about this story. Wilbur and Orville grew up in a home with no electricity, no plumbing. They were encouraged to read a lot by their father. They didn't go to college. They had no money, only a small business, and even with all of that, they were both very smart young men, dedicated, hardworking, and even though they were both very different, they worked together very well. And so I couldn't help but think about me and my sister, who I have a great relationship with my sister. She's my best friend, and even though we're very different, we just have this connection, and both brothers had a connection and they were able to do something amazing. There's so many great pictures throughout this book. David McCullough, his books might read as a little dry, but I still find them fascinating. He is able to incorporate a lot of diary entries and letters and news articles and speeches and all kinds of things from Wilbur, Orville, his father, his sister, their sister Catherine. And so you kind of get an overall comprehensive picture about what really happened and who they were like as people. He just does such a great job in giving you all of the facts, but also keeping you engaged. At least he keeps me engaged, and so I love his books. I gave this one 5 stars. I absolutely loved it. I think it's a very inspiring story, and one that I recommend that people check out if you're into history or science, or, you know, mechanics, or just want to know what it was like to build the first airplane. I think it was a great story and one of my favorites of the month. Next, I read Devil's Knot by Mary Leveritt, and this is the true story about the West Memphis Three. This was incredibly infuriating to read. This is essentially the story of 3 young men, Damien Eccles, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Miskelly. They were charged with the murder of 3 8-year-old boys in West Memphis, Arkansas in 1993. The author takes us through the case bit by bit. She kind of pieces it all together for you. So I thought that was really helpful because this case could be very confusing because the case itself is confusing. So I thought that that was really well done, and it really helped me keep track of what was happening. This case was just extraordinary. There was no motive, no physical evidence linking any of the 3 guys to the murders or the crime scene. There were no other suspects investigated. There was crappy police work, just absolutely hot mess of a case. They focused on Damien Eccles because he was different. He wore black shirts. He liked Metallica. He was into Wicca. And so naturally that meant that he was part of a satanic cult. And Jason, his friend from school, of course had to have something to do with it, because who would be friends with someone like Damien Eccles? And then Jesse is just someone with a very low IQ, someone that's very shy and easily manipulated. And so the police kind of hounded him and coerced him into giving a completely ridiculous confession. You can see that he does not have a clue what he's talking about, and yet they use his confession to rope all 3 into these murders. They were all 3 charged with the murder, and all 3 were sent to prison, where they were incarcerated for 18 years. It is an absolutely infuriating story. It just goes to show how flawed our judicial system is. This is for people that were maybe a fan of Making a Murderer on Netflix. If you're okay with throwing books at the wall, if you have no problem with losing your shit at what you're reading and can't believe what you're reading and have to take breaks, if that sounds like fun to you, then I definitely recommend this book. I thought that it was a very interesting story, and I'm really glad that I read it, if only so that it could, you know, piss me off and really put things in perspective for me. I don't want to say I enjoyed it, but you know what I mean. And then the last book that I read was Lust Killer by Ann Rule. I actually listened to this on audiobook. It was an amazing audiobook. I'll link it down below. And this is the true story of a serial killer named Jerry Brudos in Oregon. He abducted and killed young women, and then after he killed them, he would dress them up in clothes and take pictures of them and sometimes have sex with them. This happened in the 1960s, so the story is basically about how he grew up, the different murders that he committed and how he was found guilty, the investigation, the trial, his sentencing, and then his life in prison. This was back in the 1960s, so how he was kind of found guilty and the investigation and all of that was really interesting to read about, because we didn't have DNA back then and we didn't have a lot of the modern technology that we do now, but they were able to build a solid case, and so that was really interesting to read about. I definitely flew through this. I thought it was very readable. It kind of read like a thriller, so this would be a perfect book for someone who's new to true crime. I thought it was really well done. The audiobook was amazing. I'll have all of that information down below if you're interested, but definitely a great one to try if you're interested in true crime. So that's all that I read this month. I had an amazing reading month. I'm really excited about December coming up. I have a couple of books lined up that I might be reading, so look out for a December MBR video very soon. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in my next video. Bye!